Welcome to Whistle Where You Work. I'm Mark Cohen, Executive Director of the Government Accountability Project. In just a little while, penetrating the fog around a mysterious State Department-funded refuge for neoconservatives, the Foundation for the Future. But first, protecting our kitchens. Eggs contaminated by salmonella, beef by a dangerous strain of E. coli, peanuts, spinach, you name it. The food industry is reeling from contamination scandals. So are the federal agencies responsible for ensuring food safety getting the job done? The Union of Concerned Scientists posed just that question and many more to the food safety professionals at the FDA and USDA. And with us to discuss the results is Francesca Grifo, Scientific Integrity Director at UCS. Welcome, Francesca, to Whistle Where You Work.
Thank you so much.
You guys are not new to conducting surveys of federal agencies, are you?
No, we've now surveyed about 9 different agencies. We've done climate scientists, we've done the Environmental Protection Agency, and we've actually done the Food and Drug Administration before.
Okay, so tell me about what you were attempting to get at with this survey.
Well, we knew from the same news accounts that you've discussed that there are obviously things that are wrong with our food safety system. But as usual, the voices from inside the agencies weren't actively part of the debate. And by that I mean not the folks at the top, but the actual rank and file, the folks that are actually inspecting the food, the scientists that are actually working on these issues. So what these surveys do is give us a way of really including them in the conversation. So we picked out a list of 8,000 scientists and food inspectors, which is actually the hardest part of doing the survey, is identifying those folks. We had a really good collaboration with Iowa State University, their Center for Survey Statistics, and working with them, put together a survey instrument and sent it out.
And so you sent it out to thousands of people.
About 8,000.
At FDA and USDA. How many results did you get?
We had over 1,000 folks come back. Actually, differs from question to question, different amounts of responses. But we had about a 21.6 response rate, which is quite good for a survey like this.
And how does that compare to your past surveys?
A little bit higher.
Interesting. And so I have to ask you about possible bias in the survey, because the Union of Concerned Scientists does have a public profile in the scientific community. You have a reputation. People know you're out there on certain issues. Would that not affect who would be interested in responding to your survey?
Well, you know, we try very hard to minimize that effect. By working with Iowa State University, we actually don't have the data. They collect the data, they process it, and they send it to us, so we can't mess with it that way. We try to have scientific integrity of our own. But I think what's really important is that Iowa worked with us on the phrasing of the questions. And then in looking at the results, there is an open-ended essay question at the end. And when you look at those responses in those essay questions, which are all on our website, you don't see that we had responses from angry, cantankerous people. In fact, the responses come back, and you can hear it in their words in these essays, from scientists who care, from inspectors who are worried about the system. On the other hand, we had some very positive results. We had a very large number of folks come back to us and say, we do think about public health. Public health really matters. So if we had just captured the embittered, you know, I don't think we would have gotten those kind of responses.
Okay, so let's talk about the specifics. Tell me about some of the most important findings in the survey.
Well, I think the top line findings are that we didn't just find political interference, but we found political interference and corporate interference. And I think, interestingly, interference by Congress and interference by, you know, other nonprofits. So everybody's got an act in this game. Everybody wants to influence it, and it's very hard for the folks at the agencies to push back against that influence.
Okay, so what does interference mean in this context?
It means lots of things, but I think in terms of Congress, for example, we had instances where members of Congress who had large food facilities, processing facilities in their districts would go to the top levels of FDA and say, hey, back off. You know, we don't want these inspections turning this stuff up. We don't want this particular company being closed down. And the connections, you know, are obvious. I mean, these large companies are, you know, making donations to campaigns and then going to their decision makers and saying, help, you know, we're being regulated. Well, of course they're being regulated. That's how you and I have safe food.
Was that an anomalous finding, or was there a significant number of instances where employees at FDA or USDA said that there was interference of that kind?
There were hundreds who reported that.
And this would be interference by Congress, interference by
Interference by Congress. There were hundreds alone that reported that interference by Congress.
But isn't that in some ways appropriate? Isn't that what Congress is there for, to look out for constituents?
Congress is there to open up an investigation, to ask questions. Congress is not there to ask the agency to put the science aside and not make the best decision that is the most protective decision of the American public.
Okay, but what about business interference? How did that play out?
Well, I think there were instances, where people reported that they were asked by the, upper levels of FDA who were having off-the-record conversations with these businesses and USDA to, withhold certain data, to not use all the information, particularly when approving a product for sale. And that's a problem. Obviously, we want all the information to be there. We want scientists, inspectors, all of these folks to feel like if they see a problem, that they have a place to go with those issues and really talk about them.
Mm-hmm. You also did a little bit of looking at the impact of the so-called revolving door, people going from industry to government, government to industry. What did you find there?
That's a hard one. We found some instances of where a lot of people are freely moving back and forth between the food safety industries and the government agencies that regulate them. Now, on its face, that sounds like a terrible thing, but I'm not sure it's always terrible. I think it's just something that has to be disclosed completely so that we know which employees are doing that, and we can sort of look at that in the context of their job performance. But I think you don't want to completely cut off that kind of flow of expertise, because clearly people develop an incredible expertise in the agencies that's useful in industry, and they develop, I think more importantly, an incredible expertise in the industry that's very useful for the agency when it's regulating. But it is certainly something that needs to be watched carefully.
Speaking of watching, you took a look at whether employees at FDA, USDA thought that stronger whistleblower protections might result in stronger food safety. And what did you find on that score?
Very strong support for more whistleblower protections. I mean, you hate to be in a situation where you depend on that. We'd love to have a system where the system worked, because obviously blowing the whistle is a terribly traumatic event for anybody that does it. But in this case, what we did find was that, there were many, many workers who really wanted to have those protections, because clearly they were seeing things that they wanted to talk about.
Tell me about some of those. You profiled some of the whistleblowers in your report. Tell me about some of those.
Well, there were a number of them. I mean, in a general sense, without talking about specifics, I think these were people who were in the food industry, on the line, watching what was going on, and had deep, deep concerns about it. Things like practices that were not protective of public health. For example, instances where there were large vats used to cleanse carcasses, and those vats were contaminated and the water was contaminated, so even if you have clean carcasses, the fecal matter ends up contaminating the whole batch. I mean, that's a huge problem, and we were very fortunate to have people come forward to the Government Accountability Project to really reveal those stories, which were very useful to us, especially useful because we understood those stories when we were putting the survey together, and it was really helpful to know what we were trying to understand.
Okay, so tell me about some of the take-home messages of the survey to you.
Well, I think the take-home message is a number of things. I mean, Congress is obviously working hard to try and get something done legislatively, but I think when we go take a step back and really look at the political interference issues.
You're talking about the Food Modernization Act.
I am.
And you say that they're working hard to get this done. I think some people would argue maybe that they're not working quite hard enough because it hasn't gotten done.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there are things in that piece of legislation that will give the Food and Drug Administration more resources, more authority, very important pieces of this so that they can actually step in.
And those whistleblower protections.
And those whistleblower protections, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And of course, those whistleblower protections we're working to try and get on a number of fronts. It's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. But I think in addition to those specific things in that Food Safety Modernization Act, there are broader issues about political interference. I mean, when you have two different agencies, and we looked at USDA and the Food and Drug Administration, both reporting very similar results, you have to understand that this is a systemic problem, that this is something that's happening across multiple agencies, multiple arenas, and until we are able to really have these broad agency practices that not just happen, but that are actually become part of the agency fabric and part of the agency culture, this is going to be an ongoing challenge and one that we need to watch.
And so how do we get that?
Well, right now we are trying and waiting very patiently for the March 2009 memo that President Obama put out on scientific integrity, which had fabulous principles in it for what should happen to actually be implemented in the agencies.
This was one of the first things he did after he took office, wasn't it?
Yep. He was inaugurated in January of 2009, and this was the beginning of March 2009. So very quickly, very important.
So you've been monitoring this. What is taking so long to get from there to here?
Well, I think it's hard. I mean, it's really difficult. Anybody who's worked in a federal agency knows what a morass of bureaucracy that is. So I think that's one piece of it. But I think it's been just held up because this administration has been very busy with lots of things. And I think it's a kind of revolutionary. I think people are very afraid of it. They're worried about, oh my God, what will happen if we actually give scientists the ability to freely talk to the press? You know, what will happen if we allow publications that aren't official government publications? What will happen if we open up the doors and really bring in this kind of transparency that, you know, we all want to see? It's scary. I mean, it's very scary, and it certainly means a loss of control. So I think it takes a while for them to figure this out. We are hoping that we will see that executive order very soon, because the hard thing is, you know, the executive order is not the end. The hard part is really going to be taking that executive order and figuring out how the agencies implement it and how we get those cultural changes that will be harder for the next administration to reverse.
Well, many thanks to Francesca Grifo of the Union of Concerned Scientists for sharing your survey results with us, and hopefully change we can believe in is on the way for our troubled food system. When we return, just what is the secretive foundation for the future? Does the name Paul Wolfowitz ring a bell? And why are taxpayers financing this foundation?